Minutes after General Canby was murdered under a flag of truce, chaos erupted in the U.S. Army camp. The commanding colonel reportedly froze, unable to issue orders as his officers screamed for direction. While the Modoc attackers escaped, rescuers found Canby and Reverend Thomas dead, stripped, and scalped. A third man clung to life, saved only by a Modoc woman's intervention. This disastrous failure of leadership marked the start of a renewed, vengeful campaign against the Modoc people. The roots of the immediate crisis stretched back to the 29th of November, 1872. On that day, 40 U.S. soldiers, accompanied by a few local volunteers, approached Captain Jack's camp on Lost River. Their orders were direct: compel the Modoc band to return to the Klamath Reservation in Oregon, a place they had previously left due to internal conflicts and poor conditions. The attempted forcible removal ignited immediate combat. Gunfire erupted. When the smoke cleared, 1 U.S. soldier was dead and 7 wounded. Among the Modoc, a warrior fell, and tragically, a woman and her infant were killed in the chaos. The Lost River fight shattered any remaining semblance of peace. Captain Jack led his people, numbering around 150, south, seeking refuge in the formidable natural fortress of the lava beds near Tule, California. This labyrinth of volcanic caves, trenches, and ridges offered a significant defensive advantage. During this flight, however, a splinter group, led by a warrior named Hooker Jim, vented their rage upon the nearby settlements. They attacked isolated ranches around Tule Lake, killing at least 12 male settlers. This act significantly inflamed local sentiment and complicated Captain Jack's position, as he would later be held accountable by the U.S. government for actions he did not directly command. Simultaneously, another Modoc group, uninvolved in the Lost River fight, had sought refuge on the Klamath Reservation, hoping to remain neutral. Their reception was hostile. Oregon settlers living near the reservation threatened them, nearly leading to their summary execution. Fearing for their lives, this group fled the reservation and joined Captain Jack in the lava beds, swelling the numbers within the natural fortification soon known as Jack's Stronghold. Of the approximately 150 Modoc gathered there, only about 50 were fighting men. The rest were women, children, and the elderly. The U.S. Army soon converged on the stronghold. On the 17th of January, 1873, under Colonel Frank Wheaton, the military launched its first major assault. Nearly 400 soldiers, including regulars and volunteers from California and Oregon, advanced through thick fog. The Modoc, concealed among the rocks, utilized their knowledge of the terrain to devastating effect. The attack was a costly failure for the Army. Official reports listed 37 soldiers killed or wounded, with 0 Modoc casualties reported. The repulsed soldiers withdrew, and a siege began. For nearly 3 months, an uneasy stalemate persisted. The Army surrounded the stronghold, cutting off easy access, while peace commissioners attempted negotiations. The government's terms were harsh: unconditional surrender, and the handing over of Hooker Jim and others involved in the Tule killings for trial. Captain Jack found himself in an increasingly difficult position. He personally favored surrender, recognizing the futility of prolonged resistance against overwhelming force. However, he represented a minority faction within the stronghold. Influence shifted towards more militant figures, notably the band's spiritual leader, curly-headed doctor, and warriors like Hooker Jim and Shanshan John. They advocated continued resistance, bolstered by the initial military failures and the perceived power of the doctor's protective medicine. They pressured Jack relentlessly, questioning his courage, shaming him publicly, and reportedly threatening him if he pursued surrender. Cornered and undermined, Captain Jack eventually acquiesced to a desperate plan hatched by the war faction, a deadly act of betrayal disguised as a peace parley. On Good Friday, the 11th of April, 1873, General Edward Canby, Reverend Eleazar Thomas, Bureau of Indian Affairs agent Alfred Meacham, interpreter Frank Riddle, and Agent L.S. Dyer met Captain Jack, Shanshan John, Boston Charlie, Bogus Charlie, Black Jim, and Hooker Jim in the agreed-upon neutral zone between the stronghold and the Army lines. It was during these talks that the plan sprung into action. Captain Jack drew a concealed revolver and shot General Canby point blank beneath the chin. Simultaneously, Boston Charlie shot Reverend Thomas. Chaos ensued. Meacham was shot multiple times by Shunkin John. Dyer and Frank Riddle escaped the sudden attack, running for their lives back towards the Army lines. Black Jim attempted to shoot Meacham again, but Toby Riddle, Frank's Modoc wife who had accompanied the peace party, intervened, reportedly striking Black Jim and shouting at the attackers, saving Meacham from immediate death. The Modoc warriors quickly stripped the bodies of Canby and Thomas and partially scalped Canby, Meacham, and Thomas before retreating rapidly back into the stronghold, leaving Meacham grievously wounded. Easter Sunday, 1873, dawned differently in Jack's stronghold. There were no customary Easter observances. Instead, the air filled with the sounds of celebration and dancing. Following the killings, the perpetrators returned to the stronghold with their spoils. Bogus Charlie and Boston Charlie divided Reverend Thomas's clothing. Hooker Jim, Shunkin John, and Shacknesty Jim took Alfred Meacham's attire. Captain Jack claimed General Canby's blood-stained uniform, reluctantly giving the general's pocket watch to Ellen's man George. General Canby's scalp was added to the medicine pole belonging to Curly-Headed Doctor, a symbol believed to offer protection. The dancing and festivities continued for 3 nights. From an external perspective, this celebration might seem baffling given the inevitable military response. However, within the Modoc worldview at that moment, shaped by recent events and cultural beliefs, their actions made sense. They had successfully repelled one major attack without loss. Their spiritual leader's medicine seemed potent, and they had now eliminated the highest-ranking military officer opposing them. It's plausible many believed the Army, having lost its commander, might withdraw. Their experience was largely based on intertribal warfare, not the sustained, resource-heavy campaigns typical of the U.S. military. They perceived themselves as being in a position of strength, having struck a powerful blow. The celebration stemmed not from ignoring reality, but from interpreting it through their own cultural lens, a belief, however fleeting, that they might yet prevail. Prior to the betrayal, some room for negotiation might have existed, though accountability for the Tule Lake killings remained a sticking point. Killing Canby removed all such possibilities. The Army's reaction to the assassinations was inexplicably slow, largely attributed to the inaction of Colonel Alvin Gillum, the senior officer present after Canby. Just minutes before Canby and Thomas were shot, a separate deadly incident occurred near Major E.C. Mason's hospital camp east of the stronghold. 2 Modoc approached Lieutenants William Sherwood and William Boyle under a flag of truce. As the officers turned away after the brief exchange, one Modoc retrieved a hidden rifle and shot Sherwood in the back, killing him instantly. Boyle escaped. Captain Charles B. Throckmorton at a nearby signal station heard the shots. Aware of the concurrent peace talks, he signaled a warning message to Colonel Gillum, emphasizing the danger to Canby and the commissioners if the Modoc were initiating attacks. As Gillum was reportedly composing a warning note to Canby, the volley of shots signaling the murders of Canby and Thomas echoed across the lava beds. Initial reports, likely attempts to protect Gillum's reputation, claimed he acted swiftly, leading a rescue party and even firing shots at the fleeing Modoc. The reality appears starkly different. Multiple accounts suggest Gillum froze upon hearing the gunfire. Confusion reigned in the main Army camp. Officers and non-commissioned officers shouted orders, men mustered, but without clear direction from the commanding officer, effective action stalled. In Gillum's defense, some sources suggest he was unwell at the time. He died only 18 months later at age 45. Whether illness contributed to his paralysis at that critical moment remains unclear. The delay proved critical. Finally, Major James Biddle confronted the situation, reportedly escorting Gillum to his tent and assuming de facto command. Biddle ordered troops forward towards the peace tent, their mission now grimly shifted to rescue or recovery. As the soldiers advanced, they encountered L.S. Dyer and Frank Riddle fleeing the scene in terror. Within roughly 30 minutes of the killings, the rescue party reached the site. They found the bodies of General Canby and Reverend Thomas stripped and partially scalped. Alfred Meacham lay nearby, severely wounded. stripped to his undergarments, and also partially scalped, but alive. Toby Riddle was attempting to tend to his wounds. An army surgeon accompanying the rescue party took over, administering brandy, a common period treatment for shock. The soldiers carried the dead and the critically injured Meacham back to the camp. The immediate shock gave way to grim determination. The weekend would be spent planning the Army's inevitable forceful response. Number 2, turning point and new Army strategy. The weekend following the assassinations marked a decisive shift in the conflict, particularly in public perception. Any lingering sympathy for Captain Jack and his band evaporated across the region. In nearby Eureka, California, where General Canby's body lay in state at his residence, angry citizens burned effigies in the streets. The killings under truce had irrevocably hardened attitudes. Peace was no longer considered an option by the U.S. government or the public. Negotiations ceased entirely. The sentiment reached the highest levels, with President Ulysses S. Grant reportedly calling for severe measures against the Modoc. With diplomacy abandoned, the military focused solely on defeating the Modoc entrenched in the lava beds. Intense debate arose regarding the best tactical approach to overcome the Stronghold's natural defenses, which had proven so effective in the January assault. Several unconventional and perhaps desperate options were considered. The use of poison gas was discussed, as was deploying sharpshooters equipped with telescopic sights to pick off Modoc defenders from concealed positions among the volcanic rocks. Sending in dogs to flush out or attack the Modoc was proposed alongside the potential use of body armor for advancing troops. Ultimately, however, the Army settled on a more conventional, attritional strategy. No intricate flanking maneuvers, complex deceptions, or dramatic large-scale charges like the first failed assault were planned. Instead, the approach would be a slow, grinding advance. Infantry would move deliberately across the tortuous volcanic terrain, pressing forward from cover to cover, meter by meter. It was a strategy acknowledging the lethality of the Modoc defense and the difficult ground, essentially committing troops to methodically push through the hell of lava rock, minimizing exposure, but accepting the likelihood of steady casualties in a slow push towards the Modoc positions. The advance was anticipated to be arduous and extremely slow. The second assault on the Stronghold commenced in the early hours of the 15th of April, just 4 days after Canby's assassination. Alerted to the Army's movements, Captain Jack dispatched 8 Modoc warriors outside the main defensive perimeter. These fighters concealed themselves among the outer lava formations, acting as an advanced skirmish line with the objective of delaying the soldiers' progress as much as possible. Their tactics proved effective. The disciplined, slow advance of the approximately 400 U.S. soldiers ground almost to a halt under the harassing fire from unseen positions. It took nearly 6 hours for the main body of troops to cover just half a mile. The cost of this limited gain was 3 soldiers killed and 6 wounded. By day's end, the Army line was still 1,000 yards from the heart of the Stronghold, close enough perhaps to glimpse General Canby's scalp displayed on the medicine pole. Unlike the first battle in January, the soldiers received orders not to withdraw at nightfall. They were instructed to hold their positions, digging in amongst the jagged rocks, constructing rudimentary breastworks, and enduring a tense, sleepless night exposed on the unforgiving terrain. The following day, the 16th of April, the Army's artillery began its bombardment. Coehorn mortars lobbed shells into the Modoc defenses. Initially, the shelling inflicted minimal physical damage. The Modoc had utilized the natural caves and crevices effectively, fortifying them further. Women and children sheltered deep within caves, their entrances barricaded with piled rocks to deflect shrapnel and ricochets. The infantry advance resumed its cautious crawl forward, soldiers moving deliberately from one lava outcrop to the next. Progress remained slow, measured in yards rather than miles. Despite the slow pace, the second day marked a significant psychological blow to the Modoc. The advancing soldiers managed to overrun the location of curly-headed doctor's primary medicine line, a symbolic boundary intended to magically repel the attackers. Breaching this line visibly shook Modoc morale. Later that evening, this spiritual setback was compounded by the first Modoc casualty of the battle. An artillery shell landed within the stronghold but failed to detonate. A curious Modoc individual, one source suggests a child, though this is unconfirmed, reportedly picked up the dud shell and attempted to open it, possibly trying to pry the fuse out with their teeth. The shell exploded, killing them instantly. Another shell scored a direct hit on the main council fire, scattering embers and alarming those gathered nearby. While this second impact caused no injuries, the combination of the breached medicine line and the deadly accident involving the dud shell shattered the remaining faith in curly-headed doctor's protective power. In this moment of crisis and disillusionment, leadership reverted to Captain Jack. He reassumed effective command of the remaining defenders. That night, the Modoc launched several probing, harassing attacks against the soldiers' lines, but wisely refrained from committing significant numbers to a full-scale, potentially suicidal counter-assault. Instead, as the weary soldiers tried to rest, the Modoc warriors positioned themselves within earshot and began hurling verbal insults and taunts, questioning the soldiers' parentage and the virtue of their female relatives, adding psychological pressure to the physical exhaustion of the troops. A crucial tactical success for the Army came as they tightened their cordon, although they never achieved the full encirclement initially planned. They successfully gained control of the Modoc's primary access to water from Tule Lake. This was a devastating blow. While humans can survive weeks without food, lack of water becomes debilitating within days, causing extreme suffering, particularly for the non-combatants, the women, children, and elderly, including at least one infant born during the siege. Facing dwindling morale, the failure of spiritual protection, and the critical loss of water, Captain Jack made the difficult decision late that evening. He ordered an evacuation. Leaving a small rear guard to maintain fire and create the illusion of continued full occupation, the majority of the Modoc, including families, slipped away under cover of darkness. They utilized a low depression leading into a lava tube system, now known as Scotch Inflow, effectively melting into the labyrinthine landscape beyond the Army's immediate perimeter. While the main body of Modoc effected their escape, Ellen's man George led a small diversionary raid against Colonel Gillam's supply camp. This camp was relatively lightly guarded, as most troops were engaged in the main assault. George's party attempted to draw the remaining soldiers out into an ambush, firing shots and shouting challenges. Fortunately for the troops, the camp defenders did not take the bait and maintained their positions. However, tragedy struck civilians caught near the shifting lines. The following day around noon, a 19-year-old civilian teamster named Howe, or Hoovy, accompanied by two newspaper correspondents, inadvertently stumbled upon Hooker Jim's group, likely operating outside the main stronghold during the evacuation. Hoovy was shot and killed. His body was stripped and mutilated. The two correspondents fled for their lives. It wasn't until approximately 11 a.m. the next day, the 17th of April, that the Army fully realized the stronghold was abandoned. Advancing troops finally entered the central defensive positions to find them empty, save for possibly one or two elderly or infirm Modoc left behind, who were reportedly killed by the soldiers. The Second Battle of the Stronghold was over. Reported casualties vary, but Army losses amounted to approximately 7 killed and over a dozen wounded. Modoc losses were minimal, perhaps only the individual killed by the exploding shell and the one or two elderly individuals found in the evacuated stronghold. Precise casualty figures for the entire Modoc War remain difficult to ascertain definitively. Though driven from their formidable base, the Modoc were far from defeated. Arguably, they now pose a different, perhaps even greater threat. Contained within the stronghold, their location was known, and military efforts could be concentrated. Now, dispersed within the vast and confusing lava beds, their whereabouts were unknown. The fear of random attacks on isolated settlers or supply wagons intensified. How many more unfortunate individuals, like the young teamster Hoovy, would fall victim to warriors operating unpredictably? Furthermore, the Modoc were now desperate. This wasn't just a band of 50 warriors. It included their families. Captain Jack himself had 2 wives and at least 1 daughter. Most other warriors had dependents as well. The majority of the fleeing Modoc, numbering at least 100, were non-combatants. A warrior fighting for his own survival is dangerous. A man fighting desperately for the survival of his family is often more so. 9 days after the Modoc vanished from the Stronghold, on the 26th of April, Captain Evan Thomas of the 12th U.S. Infantry led a reconnaissance patrol of approximately 70 men out from the Army camp. Intelligence suggested the Modoc warriors might be concealed within a specific lava flow formation nearby. Captain Thomas's objective was to locate their position and identify suitable ground for deploying artillery to dislodge them. Precisely why the patrol chose its midday resting spot remains unclear, perhaps underestimation of the Modoc proximity or inadequate reconnaissance. Regardless, Captain Thomas halted his command for lunch in a tactically disastrous location, a small depression at the base of Sand Butte, enclosed on 3 sides by cliffs and ridges. It was a natural kill zone, a cul-de-sac offering only one avenue of retreat. Unbeknownst to the soldiers, Modoc warriors had been shadowing their movements, having circled around their flanks miles earlier. As the troopers dismounted and prepared their meal, the Modoc fighters, likely under the direction of Scarface Charlie, moved into prepared positions along the overlooking slopes. The soldiers below were completely exposed, caught in a natural trap. Compounding the error, no security pickets had been posted. Rifles, mostly Springfield Model 1866 or 1870 breechloaders, were neatly stacked out of immediate reach. Some soldiers had even removed their boots for comfort. Though the soldiers outnumbered the Modoc ambushers perhaps 2 to 1, their unpreparedness negated this advantage. Suddenly, Scarface Charlie gave the signal. A devastating volley erupted from the surrounding heights. The depression at the foot of Sand Butte instantly transformed into a scene of carnage. Of the 67 soldiers who had dismounted for lunch, 25 were killed or mortally wounded within minutes. Few escaped injury. The Modoc fire discipline and positioning were brutally effective. The fight could have resulted in the complete annihilation of Thomas's command. However, for reasons unknown, perhaps dwindling ammunition or a strategic decision, Scarface Charlie ordered his warriors to cease firing around 3 p.m. He called down from the ridge to the terrified, pinned-down survivors below. "All you fellas who ain't dead yet better go on home. We don't want to kill you all in one day." True to his word, the Modoc fire stopped. Relief for the shattered command was tragically slow in coming. Colonel Gillum, back at the main camp, initially failed to dispatch a rescue force upon receiving word of the engagement. This inaction proved to be the final error, contributing to his removal from command shortly thereafter. When a relief party was finally organized, it became lost during the night, delaying aid further. The survivors of the ambush lay exposed on the cold ground, many bleeding, for hours. When rescuers finally located them, the evacuation of the wounded began under appalling conditions. A cold rain started, quickly turning to snow. The injured had to be carried out on makeshift stretchers. They endured a second night exposed to the elements after the attack. Historian Keith A. Murray described the state of the survivors. By dawn, the weary column found itself closer to the old stronghold than to Gillum's camp, so they headed toward it for shelter. The men were exhausted, 2 days' beard stubble whitened by the snow. Since they had not taken sufficient warm clothing at the start, they were now thoroughly chilled. Their food and water had been insufficient for a 36-hour expedition, and much of what they carried had been given to the wounded. An army had marched into the lava beds. A rabble of straggling, disorganized, and worn-out men returned. The meticulously planned campaign had suffered another shocking setback. While the army regrouped after the Dry Lake disaster, the dispersed Modoc bands faced their own critical struggle, securing water. Driven from the stronghold and its reliable access to Tule Lake, they became fugitives in the arid landscape, constantly moving between hidden camps and caves within the lava beds. Survival depended on finding scarce water sources. For a period, they relied on chipping away ice accumulated over months or years within lava tube ice caves. These finite frozen reserves melted quickly when consumed by over 150 thirsty men, women, and children. They spent 3 days exhausting the supply in a cave known as Captain Jack's Ice Cave, potentially still accessible today, before moving several miles south to Caldwell Ice Cave. Around May 8th, they established a camp on a dry lake bed south of Scorpion Point. Here, the desperate search for water involved digging by hand into the parched earth to reach subterranean moisture. Every day was a battle for basic sustenance against the harsh environment. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army command structure underwent a significant change. Colonel Gillem, discredited by his perceived inaction following the Canby assassination and the disastrous Dry Lake ambush, was relieved of command. His replacement, tasked with bringing the Modoc War to a decisive end, was Brigadier General Jefferson C. Davis. This Davis, despite sharing a name with the former president of the Confederacy, was a Union general, albeit a controversial figure himself. Davis's career included shooting and killing fellow Union General William Bull Nelson in Louisville, Kentucky in 1862, following a heated argument where Nelson reportedly slapped Davis and called him an insolent puppy. Davis procured a pistol and shot Nelson in the chest. Despite a brief arrest, Davis was never formally charged or court-martialed for Nelson's death, possibly due to wartime exigencies. He was later promoted to Major General and participated in General William T. Sherman's infamous March to the Sea in 1864. This campaign generated further controversy for Davis. His column was followed by hundreds of formerly enslaved people seeking freedom and safety with the Union Army. Viewing these refugees as an impediment to his military operations, Davis ordered his engineers to dismantle the pontoon bridge over Ebenezer Creek near Savannah, Georgia, immediately after his troops had crossed. This action stranded the freedmen on the opposite bank, with Confederate cavalry closing in. A horrific scene ensued as Confederate troops attacked the trapped refugees, many of whom drowned attempting to swim the creek to escape. Davis faced no official punishment for this incident either, though he was reportedly posted to the remote Department of Alaska for a time before returning to commands in the continental U.S. This was the experienced, controversial, and determined commander now tasked with capturing Captain Jack and ending the Modoc resistance. Despite their recent victory at Dry Lake, the Modoc remained elusive. The Army relied increasingly on scouts, particularly Native American auxiliaries from the Warm Springs Reservation in Oregon, to track Captain Jack's band. These scouts reported signs indicating the Modoc were likely operating southeast of the main lava beds area. This intelligence proved accurate when a group of Modoc warriors ambushed 3 Army supply wagons traveling through the region. The wagons, significantly carrying casks of whiskey, were captured. 3 soldiers escorting the wagons were wounded in the brief fight. The victorious Modoc reportedly consumed much of the captured whiskey on the spot, achieving a temporary alcohol-fueled respite from their desperate situation. In response to this raid and seeking to pin down the Modoc, Captain James C. Hasbrook led a force consisting of his own Battery B, 4th U.S. Artillery, fighting as infantry, reinforced by 2 troops of cavalry. On May 10, Hasbrook's command established a camp on the edge of a dry lake bed known locally, perhaps crudely, as Sore Ass Lake, or Sorass Lake. Army intuition, guided by the recent wagon attack, suggested the Modoc were nearby, some possibly still recovering from the effects of the captured whiskey. As dawn broke, the Modoc launched a surprise attack on Hasbrook's camp. The exact number of soldiers under Hasbrook or the precise number of Modoc warriors involved is unclear, but accounts confirm Captain Jack himself led the assault. The initial Modoc volley was effective. 2 soldiers were killed instantly, and another 3 or 4 were wounded. As startled troopers scrambled for cover or attempted to flee, 3 more soldiers fell, 1 suffering mortal wounds. During the chaotic fighting, Captain Jack was reportedly seen on the slopes overlooking the camp, directing the attack while wearing the uniform jacket taken from the body of General Canby. For a moment, it seemed another Army disaster was unfolding. However, unlike the Dry Lake ambush, leadership emerged from the ranks. Non-commissioned officers rallied the disorganized soldiers. Notably, First Sergeant Thomas Kelly of Battery B took decisive action. Described as a tough, experienced Irish immigrant soldier, Kelly reportedly yelled, "God damn it, let's charge!" He led his men forward in a counterattack, taking the fight directly to the Modoc positions on the slopes. This unexpected aggression seemed to catch the Modoc off guard. Facing determined resistance and a charge rather than panicked retreat, they broke off their attack and withdrew. Hasbrouck's command suffered significant losses, 5 men killed and 8 wounded. But they had held their ground and crucially had forced the Modoc to retreat in a direct engagement. The psychological impact was significant. The soldiers now knew the Modoc were not invincible and could be beaten in open combat. For the Modoc, the Battle of Sarras Lake proved catastrophic. As they attempted to disengage from Kelly's counterattack, they ran directly into the pursuing Warm Springs scouts, leading to further skirmishes and pressure. The battle represented a turning point for several reasons. Firstly, unlike previous engagements where Modoc victories often yielded captured weapons and vital ammunition from fallen or retreating soldiers, this time they gained nothing and likely expended precious ammunition reserves. Secondly, in their hurried retreat, they lost approximately 24 horses, indispensable assets for mobility in the rugged terrain. Most devastatingly, however, was the loss of Ellen's man George. Considered one of their most skilled fighters and shrewdest tactical minds, he was mortally wounded during the battle and died later that day. His death removed a key figure from the Modoc Leadership Council and is considered by historians to have significantly accelerated the final stages of the war, weakening their capacity for coordinated resistance perhaps more than any other single event. The death of Ellen's man George at Sarras Lake fractured the already strained unity among the remaining Modoc. George belonged to the Hot Creek Band of Modoc, a group whose relationship with Captain Jack had reportedly been uneasy. Underlying tensions and factionalism, simmering since the war began, now boiled over. Even within Jack's own Lost River Band, some had advocated for war from the start, resisting his initial attempts to maintain peace. During the long siege in the Stronghold, certain factions, particularly those aligned with curly-headed Doctor, whom George strongly supported, had openly opposed surrender, resorting to taunts and threats against Jack. Rivalries among warriors vying for influence likely exacerbated these divisions. George's death became the catalyst for an open rupture. Warriors from the Hot Creek Band, along with Hooker Jim, who despite being from Jack's band consistently aligned with the war faction, blamed Captain Jack directly. They accused him of deliberately ordering George into the heaviest fighting at Sarras Lake, hoping he would be killed. This accusation, whether true or born of grief and suspicion, provided the pretext for a final break. Several key figures who had pushed hardest for war now abandoned Jack. Hooker Jim, Steamboat Frank, Bogus Charlie, and Shack Nasty Jim, along with approximately 10 other Hot Creek Modoc warriors and their families, decided to separate themselves from Jack's leadership and the ongoing conflict. They moved quickly and quietly, traveling approximately 40 miles away from the primary area of military operations. There, they sought concealment, hoping to wait out the conflict, effectively removing themselves from the fight now that victory seemed elusive. For individuals like Hooker Jim, who had been instrumental in escalating the violence, this departure appeared to some observers as abandoning the cause when fortunes turned against them. Meanwhile, Captain Jack, his fighting force now reduced to an estimated 30 warriors plus their dependents, continued his flight. Evading Army patrols, they eventually established a camp high on Big Sand Butte. Army scouts located them there roughly 10 days after the defeat at Sarras Lake. However, a tense standoff ensued rather than immediate combat. Jack, acutely aware of his dwindling manpower and critically low ammunition supplies, hesitated to engage. Furthermore, the exposed position atop the butte offered little sustenance. They lacked ready access to food and water. Facing potential encirclement by Army troops cautiously closing in, Jack once again opted for evasion. Under the cover of darkness or terrain, his group slipped away from Big Sand Butte, disappearing back into the rugged landscape. The relentless pursuit resumed. A few days after Jack's escape from Big Sand Butte, Captain Hasbrouck's command, still actively patrolling, discovered a fresh trail Following it, they were fired upon. Believing they had located Captain Jack's main group, Hasbrouck ordered a swift pursuit. The soldiers managed to capture 10 Modoc women and children. Upon questioning, it became clear these captives belonged not to Jack's band, but to the separated faction led by Hooker Jim. Apparently, Hooker Jim's group, perhaps driven by curiosity or the need for supplies, had moved closer to the areas of Army activity from their distant hiding place and had been detected. The captured women were interrogated. Subsequently, several were sent back to Hooker Jim with a message demanding his group's surrender. The terms remained unconditional, as dictated by higher command following Canby's death. However, the Army officers on the scene clarified that if the warriors surrendered, they would be treated as prisoners of war, implying they would not face immediate execution for past actions, including the Tule Lake killings or involvement in the Peace Tent Massacre. Hooker Jim sent word back that he would only surrender if John Fairchild, a local rancher known and generally trusted by the Modoc, was present to guarantee his safety. Arrangements were made, and Fairchild arrived at the Army camp. With Fairchild present as an intermediary and guarantor, the Modoc warriors of Hooker Jim's faction laid down their arms and surrendered to the military authorities. Among those who surrendered were prominent figures like Shacknesty Jim, Steamboat Frank, and the influential medicine man, Curly-Headed Doctor. One notable individual was initially absent, Hooker Jim himself. However, shortly after the main group surrendered, he dramatically ran into the Army camp, bypassed the soldiers, and burst directly into General Jefferson C. Davis's tent, reportedly throwing himself at the general's feet and begging for mercy. It appeared he had been hiding nearby, watching the surrender unfold. Only when he saw that the others were not harmed did he make his own desperate last-minute plea. According to historian Keith A. Murray, the condition of the surrendered Modoc reflected their hardships. They were described as impoverished. Their remaining horses were emaciated and lame. The men wore captured pieces of U.S. Army uniforms mixed with traditional attire. The women were still clothed in garments taken from settlers' homes the previous November, now faded, worn, and crudely patched. Many had smeared pitch on their faces, a traditional sign of mourning, perhaps for their defeat and lost comrades. Hooker Jim's gamble paid off. General Davis, eager to expedite the end of the costly conflict, saw an opportunity. He offered Hooker Jim, Bogus Charlie, Steamboat Frank, and Shacknesty Jim full amnesty for their previous actions, including the murders of settlers around Tule Lake and any complicity in the deaths of Canby and Thomas. In exchange for this pardon, they only had to do one thing: lead the army to Captain Jack. It was a deal these Modoc warriors readily accepted, agreeing to betray their former leader to save themselves. By late May 1873, Captain Jack remained at large, though his position was increasingly precarious. His band numbered perhaps 30 warriors, along with their families, though exact numbers varied, and the group often fragmented into smaller family units for concealment and foraging. Their precise location was unknown to the Army, but not to their former comrades who had just surrendered. Hooker Jim, Bogus Charlie, Steamboat Frank, and Shacknesty Jim, now cooperating with the military under promise of amnesty, possessed a good understanding of Jack's likely movements and preferred hiding spots. Dispatched by the Army, these four Modoc quickly located Jack's latest encampment. Their reception was, predictably, hostile. Captain Jack reacted with open animosity when his former allies admitted they were now working with the soldiers and had come to persuade him to surrender. He bitterly reminded them that they were the same men who had aggressively pushed for war, who had pressured him relentlessly against surrender in the Stronghold, even resorting to humiliation tactics like dressing him in women's clothing and threatening his life should he attempt to yield. Jack vehemently rebuked them, declaring he would never surrender now. If death was inevitable, he asserted, he would meet it fighting, rifle in hand, rather than face the hangman's noose. Despite Jack's defiant stance, dissent simmered among his remaining followers. Scarface Charlie, known to be a longtime friend of Jack, listened intently to the arguments presented by the four intermediaries and spent time conferring with them. The relentless pursuit, the constant hunger, The suffering of the women and children, and the knowledge that former comrades like Hooker Jim were now actively aiding the Army had taken their toll. Weariness permeated the group. Scarface Charlie, like others, was tired of running, tired of the gnawing hunger, tired of seeing families suffer, and tired of fighting a seemingly hopeless war, especially now that the betrayal from within had become overt. Hooker Jim and his companions reported back to the Army command. They estimated Jack now had only 24 warriors remaining with him, and crucially, loyalty among many was wavering. Armed with this intelligence, General Davis decided the time was opportune to press the advantage. Army columns advanced towards the reported location of Jack's camp. As the troops approached, they encountered Boston Charlie, who indicated his readiness to surrender. He reportedly even questioned the necessity of such a large military force before laying down his rifle and shaking hands with the soldiers. Following Boston Charlie's capitulation, other Modoc began to surrender, sometimes individually, sometimes in small groups, either voluntarily approaching the soldiers or being rounded up by patrols. Captain Jack, however, remained elusive, still armed and maintaining his position further up the slopes. Recognizing the need for negotiation, the Army brought forward Dr. Henry Cabinus, an Army surgeon. Cabinus had credibility, having possibly treated Meacham after the Peace Tent attack and having been present during earlier pre-assassination peace talks where he had met Jack. From a distance, Cabinus initiated communication. Jack inquired about the terms of surrender, what would happen to him if he gave up. Cabinus, likely under orders, replied that he was not authorized to make promises. Jack then lamented the condition of his people, stating they lacked adequate food and clothing. Dr. Cabinus immediately arranged for provisions to be sent up. He, along with another Modoc intermediary, distributed these supplies among Jack's band. Cabinus even spent the night near Jack's position, attempting to build trust. But when morning came, Captain Jack was gone. He had slipped away once more, ostensibly to find a better campsite, but likely unwilling to witness the final surrender of his people. The end, however, was now unavoidable. The Army pressed the pursuit relentlessly. On the 4th of June, 1873, troops finally cornered Captain Jack near Willow Creek. Initially, they located his half-brother, known as Humpy Joe, due to a physical disability. Humpy Joe was informed that they were surrounded and was instructed to fetch Jack. He complied, disappearing into the brush, but Jack did not immediately emerge. As the soldiers contemplated storming his position, Captain Jack appeared. He looked exhausted but resolute, still carrying his rifle. He asked for John Fairchild, the rancher whose presence had facilitated Hooker Jim's surrender. Major C.C. Trimble, the officer commanding the forward troops, informed Jack that Fairchild was not present. Without further negotiation, Captain Jack simply handed his rifle to the major, stating that his legs had given out, signifying his exhaustion and inability to flee further. With Captain Jack were Humpy Joe and 2 other Modoc warriors, along with their families. Their surrender marked the effective end of the Modoc War. It is noteworthy that while the primary leaders and majority of the Modoc band were now in custody, not every individual involved in the conflict was captured or surrendered. A few managed to escape the final roundups and melt away. Because they were not considered key leaders or involved in the most egregious acts like the Peace Tent killings, the Army did not pursue them extensively. Among those who evaded capture was Miller's Charlie, the warrior identified as having shot Lieutenant Sherwood in the back just prior to the Canby assassination. Miller's Charlie was never brought to trial for this act and reportedly lived for another 38 years. However, all the major figures responsible for leading the resistance or implicated in the key events of the war were now prisoners of the U.S. Army. Captain Jack, Shaunchin John, sometimes referred to as Shacknesty Jim as the Shacknesty brothers, though Shaunchin John was the elder brother figure, Curly-Headed Doctor, Boston Charlie, Scarface Charlie, Steamboat Frank, and the pardoned Hooker Jim, Bogus Charlie, and Shacknesty Jim. The fighting phase of the Modoc War was over. The legal proceedings were about to begin. With hostilities ceased and the key Modoc leaders captive, the focus shifted to legal retribution, or what passed for it under the circumstances. Captain Jack and the other prisoners were placed in irons and transported to Fort Klamath, Oregon. Jurisdictional disputes arose between state and federal authorities regarding who should try the Modoc and for what crimes. Ultimately, it was decided that a military commission would try 6 Modoc men specifically for war crimes related to the deaths of Canby and Thomas. Selected for trial were Captain Jack as the overall leader, Boston Charlie, approximately 19 or 20 years old, identified as part of Hooker Jim's raiding party after Lost River and directly involved in killing Reverend Thomas, Shanshan John, older, perhaps 40s or 50s, present at the peace tent killings and accused of shooting Alfred Meacham multiple times. Black Jim, one of Jack's original Lost River band, present at both the initial battle and the peace tent killings, and 2 very young men, Slowluck, also spelled Slowlux, and Brancho, identified as warriors who emerged with rifles at the start of the fatal peace talk ambush. During the trial, an attempt was made to clarify the defendant's status using military analogies. Jack held overall command responsibility. Shanshan John was likened to a first sergeant. Black Jim was termed a sentinel. Boston Charlie a high private. While Slowluck and Barnshaw were dismissed as essentially rankless foot soldiers, nothing at all. The trial itself, held at Fort Klamath beginning the 5th of July, 1873, is widely regarded by historians as lacking fundamental judicial fairness, essentially a show trial with a foregone conclusion. The prevailing sentiment was clear. The killing of a U.S. Army general under truce demanded execution. The military commission serving as the jury consisted of officers, some of whom had directly participated in the fighting against the defendants and likely knew soldiers killed in the conflict. The Modoc defendants were not provided with legal counsel. Compounding the communication barrier, half the defendants, including Captain Jack, spoke little or no English. Their court-appointed interpreters, Frank Riddle and his wife Toby Riddle, were also key witnesses for the prosecution, creating a clear conflict of interest by modern legal standards. The verdict came swiftly. On the 8th of July, all 6 men were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Despite the harsh climate, some calls for clemency emerged even from within the War Department. Appeals were made specifically for Slowluck and Barnshaw, arguing they were young, low-ranking participants whose most significant direct action during the peace tent affair might have been merely restraining Toby Riddle. It was noted they seemed largely disengaged during the trial, possibly not fully comprehending the proceedings or the gravity of their situation. These appeals were successful. President Grant commuted their sentences. They would be spared execution but sentenced to hard labor for life at the military prison on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. During the trial, the defendants were allowed to speak. Captain Jack vehemently denied responsibility for the 2 Lake settler killings, placing the blame squarely on Hooker Jim and his group. He also insisted Hooker Jim and others were the primary instigators behind the plot to kill Canby, forcing his hand. Jack portrayed himself as a leader who had desired peace but was overruled and pressured by the war faction, the very men like Hooker Jim, who now walked free thanks to their deal with the Army while he faced execution. The executions were scheduled for the 3rd of October, 1873. From their cells, the condemned men watched as soldiers constructed a large gallows capable of hanging multiple individuals simultaneously. They also watched as 6 graves were dug nearby, as news of the commutations for Slowluck and Barnshaw had not yet been officially relayed to the prisoners. On the appointed day, the prisoners listened respectfully to a visiting clergyman. Then, each was given a final opportunity to speak. Jack once again blamed Hooker Jim, Bogus Charlie, Shacknesty Jim, and Steamboat Frank. Slowluck and Barnshaw followed, both asserting their innocence, a understandable, if not entirely accurate claim. Black Jim spoke not of innocence, but stated he would have been a good Modoc leader had he been allowed to live. Boston Charlie delivered defiant remarks. Reportedly looking at the other prisoners, he declared them comparatively weak, stating, "I feel that I am the only man in the room. I fought in the front ranks with Shacknesty, Steamboat, Bogus, and Hooker. I am all man, not half woman. He explained the decision to kill Canby stemmed from constant fear of Army betrayal and a belief that eliminating the leaders would cause the soldiers to leave. He corroborated Jack's claim that younger warriors had pushed for the killings against Jack's wishes. Lastly, Shonshin John spoke, attributing the war's origins to the actions of Indian Agent O'Daniel at the Klamath Agency years earlier. He concluded by stating his conscience was clear and he was ready to die. Following these statements, the official commutation for Slolok and Barnshaw was announced. They would be sent to Alcatraz. With that, Captain Jack, Black Jim, Shonshin John, and Boston Charlie were marched to the gallows. After a final prayer, the trapdoor mechanism was sprung. Reports indicate Jack and Black Jim died quickly from the drop, while Shonshin John and Boston Charlie struggled briefly before succumbing. By 10:28 a.m., all four were pronounced dead, cut down, and placed in coffins. The fate of Hooker Jim remains a point of contention for many chroniclers of the war. Having instigated much of the violence, leading the Tule Lake killings, aggressively opposing surrender, pressuring Jack to kill Canby, he secured his own freedom by betraying Jack. While Jack certainly bore responsibility for pulling the trigger on Canby, Hooker Jim's actions appear pivotal in escalating the conflict to that point. His freedom came at the cost of Jack's life. Hooker Jim did not enjoy his freedom for long. He died of illness just a few years later after being relocated to Indian Territory. The origin of his moniker Hooker remains obscure. The remaining Modoc population faced displacement and division. A smaller number, generally those considered less involved in the hostilities, were eventually permitted to return to the Yainac sub-agency of the Klamath Reservation in Oregon. However, the majority, deemed the most resistant faction, were exiled as prisoners of war to the Quapaw Agency in Indian Territory, present-day northeastern Oklahoma. Records indicate 39 men, 54 women, and 60 children were forcibly relocated there. Remarkably, Scarface Charlie, despite being only 22 years old, was recognized as their leader in exile. The youth of many key Modoc figures is striking. Roughly 50 young warriors had defied the U.S. Army for nearly a year, often outmaneuvering and outfighting larger, better-equipped forces, killing the only U.S. generals slain during the Indian Wars, and inflicting dozens of casualties at a cost to the U.S. government estimated at $420,000, nearly $10 million in modern currency. Tracking the fates of other individuals yields varied stories. Barnshaw's ultimate fate after Alcatraz is unclear. Slolok, who took the name George Denny, was pardoned after serving only 5 years and lived until 1899. Curly-headed Doctor died in Indian Territory in 1890. Steamboat Frank reportedly became a minister. Scarface Charlie became known as a